You're listening to the Bible for Normal People, the only God-ordained podcast on the internet. I'm Pete Enns.
And I'm Jared Bias. All right, everybody, it's that time of year again.
Yeah, baseball season. Go Yankees.
Boo.
Yeah? Okay,
It's
fine.
time for another year of summer school. And we have some awesome classes. We're resurrecting the Hall Pass for another year, which gets you access to all 3 classes, and it's a great way to support the work we do.
Our June class is Who the Wrote the Bible, taught by the one and only Aaron Higashi.
Ever wondered who really wrote the Bible? Aaron's going to take a closer look at who may have written the Pentateuch, the historical books, and some of the most well-known prophets, plus a few thoughts on the New Testament too, of course. We're not going to leave the New Testament out, but you can expect big words like anachronisms, archaeology, ideology, but don't worry, we're going to explain them. This is the Bible for normal people after all.
And if you're ready to think about biblical authorship with a little more nuance and a lot more insight, this class is for you. The live class and Q&A are happening on Thursday, June 26th from 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, followed by an exclusive extra Q&A session just for the members of the Society of Normal People. To learn more and sign up or to purchase a hall pass, head to thebiblefornormalpeople.com/summerschool25. Hey everybody, welcome to our episode today, and we're discussing what to do about violence in the Bible with Caroline Blyth and Emily Colgan.
Yep. And Caroline and Emily both live in New Zealand, where Caroline has taught biblical studies and religious studies at the University of Auckland, and Emily teaches at Trinity Theological College.
And Caroline is also the author of the very first book in our Themes of the Bible series, Violence in the Bible for Normal People, a guide to biblical texts of terror. And together they co-host the Bloody Bible podcast.
All right, let's get into the episode.
There's a long tradition in biblical texts of protesting violence, including divine violence. Look, it's okay to be appalled by that violence. It's okay to say that it's not okay, because there's a long biblical tradition of saying that's not okay. Protesting divine violence is as biblical as the divine violence itself.
Caroline and Emily, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to have you here to talk about a very light topic, right? I don't want to alarm you, but I think there's some violence in the Bible. I've picked up on stuff just reading it, and there's a lot of violence there.
Really?
And I know. Go figure. Somebody should write a book or something. But but people aren't always really taught how to process it. It's just sort of there, and some people just ignore it completely and make believe it's not there, or they say things like, "Oh, it's not so bad," or God can do whatever God wants to do, and therefore it's fine. But maybe just to get started, give us a sense of just very briefly how you just think about the idea of violence in the Bible. Give us a couple things to just jump off from.
I would say neither of these options works very well for me. Either saying, oh, the violence is okay, or saying, oh, listen, it's some kind of ancient artifact, we shouldn't bother about it anymore. Because I think if we do that, we ignore the fact that so much of the violence we read about in the Bible is still carrying on today, including, genocide, ethnic cleansing, capital punishment, gender-based violence, wartime rape, enslavement. None of these have gone away. And so I think that's part of the reason it's so important to take seriously the violence in the Bible, because it's part of our world. And if we dismiss it in the Bible, then it makes it a lot easier for us to dismiss it here today. So
I'd maybe even want to take a step back from that and say, first of all, yes, there is violence in the Bible. It's a violent book. And I often joke with my students that it should come with an R rating, like movies do, because there are texts that are really difficult and troubling. And to be able to, as readers, to have the permission to read a text and to say, "Oh, that's rough. That's a hard text. That's a violent text." So I'd want to say that first, and then to trouble that further, as Kaz has just said.
If I'm listening for the first time and I haven't read the Bible in a while, I may be trying to kind of think about, what do you mean violence in the Bible? You listed, Caroline, you went kind of through a laundry list of types of violence that are still with us today that presumably are in the biblical text as well. So maybe even just kind of like, let's lay the groundwork for what are we talking about when we talk about violence in the Bible? Like, what are some types or some examples that, again, they are, sometimes, well, they're not sometimes, they have been historically problematic. So these are things that we are trying to wrestle with in terms of what do we do with them when we find them in our Bible, but maybe kind of set the table for what kinds of things are we talking about.
So I think that when we're talking about violence in the Bible, that we can talk about a range of different kinds of violence. So obviously the first that probably comes to mind is physical violence. So where physical force is used to injure and to abuse and to damage or to destroy. And obviously there are loads of instances of physical violence in the biblical text. So, think of Cain killing his brother Abel, for example, or, I don't know, the violence of warfare, the violence of Jesus' crucifixion in the New Testament. So that's kind of the most obvious form of violence or forms of violence that we see in the text. But we also find gender-based violence, so violence that's perpetrated against a person because of their gender. So here we're talking about sexual violence, intimate partner violence, coercive control. And when we find these kinds of texts in narratives where women like Dinah or Tamar, or whole communities of women like the women of Shiloh, are victims of rape, we see sexual, physical, emotional abuse in intimate partner violence, which we find in kind of the prophets like Ezekiel and Hosea. So that's another kind of violence that we find in the biblical text.
Yeah, and there's also the violence of language, which I think we often overlook. We don't think it's as serious as like physical violence, but some biblical texts include the violence of threats and intimidation and humiliation and sort of denigration of individuals or communities by virtue of kind of othering them, making them appear to be dangerous or defiling or unworthy of life and dehumanizing them. The prophets are full of threats, God threatening either Israel or threatening Israel's enemies. And they're really quite sort of terrifying threats. Even Jesus uses violent language to talk about his detractors. He refers to them as a brood of vipers and hypocrites and blind fools. And, he refers to some of his fellow Jews as, sort of children of the devil. And that language, as I say, I was brought up with the old adage of, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But I think, language, and we still see this today, language has an incredible power to dehumanize and completely kind of destroy the lives of people through intolerance and bullying and hatred. And that itself kind of helps foster further physical violence as well. And then the last type of violence that we see in the Bible, and again, this one is less obvious and apparent, and we often overlook it or take it for granted. And that's what is often referred to as structural violence. And that basically, in a nutshell, if you think of society as a ladder, a hierarchy, and those who have power sit at the top of that hierarchy by virtue of their ethnicity or their religion or their social status or their gender. And those who sit lower down that hierarchy have less power. And the people at the top of the hierarchy are able to enact physical violence and all forms of violence against those lower down because they have less power. Right. And so we have this kind of hierarchy of injustice where power enables certain people to hurt, harm, or even destroy others. And we see that in the Bible in the institution of enslavement, for example, or patriarchy is a form of structural violence because depending on your gender, where you sit on that ladder, that hierarchy depends on your gender. So that's just some examples.
Yeah. One question, just maybe even to take a step further back in this discussion, and this is a question you've probably heard. I hear it a lot from students. Like, why is there so much violence in the Bible? And it's not just people killing people. The violence that gets people is divine violence, either God doing it or looking at it or not condemning it. There's God's presence and in this violent, this baked into Scripture almost violence, and that's a hard thing for people to understand, and especially for those who don't really think God is violent. I don't think God is violent, but God is presented as violent in many places in Scripture. So, how would you navigate a question like that?
That's a good question. I think this, maybe at the very start, I would say that how we respond to that question, or how we think about divine violence particularly, will depend on our relationship to the text. Do we see it as the word of God, like literally, or the inspired word of God, or do we look at it more as a sort of human creation, human words, human attempts to understand God and to understand the mysteries of God? And I think our answer to that question will very much shape how we then think about divine violence. For my own part, I see the Bible as a book that's been created by ancient people in ancient times as they wrestle with a God who's mysterious and who's unknowable in so many ways. And so these stories about divine violence for me are kind of attempts, and sometimes imperfect attempts, to wrestle with the fact that this God who they believe is all powerful and who loves the covenant community so much can appear to do terrible things. Why have we lost our land? Why have we been sent into exile? Why do our enemies always defeat us on the battlefield? And in an attempt to answer that question, they may perceive God as someone who is capable of violence against, the community that God loves. And so we get this picture of a very jealous and angry and emotional God. For me, a God who's capable of doing atrocious things, murdering children, killing the love of his life.
Touchy, not just emotional, but touchy. Like touchy. It doesn't take much. It doesn't take much, right?
No. Well, I think that's it's Emily and I have both studied gender-based violence quite a lot in our research, and I see God as the depictions of God sometimes remind me of that. Those people, often men, who do lash out with violence when they're humiliated, or they feel that they've been disrespected, or that their partner and those they love are disloyal to them. Touchy is perhaps a good word. He's a sort of hair trigger in terms of how the God's humiliated fury gets kind of dished out to both the enemies of Israel and to Israel itself. And so I think these stories, to come back to the initial question, I think these stories are the ancient Israelites' efforts to wrestle with a God who seems to at times treat them really badly, and to understand that and make sense of it.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that, Emily?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, and I agree, Kaz, the only thing I'd add is that these texts, we know kind of from a historical critical point of view, they're being written across kind of hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in lots of contexts, or in lots of the places and spaces that these texts are kind of coming out of, we're talking about contexts of empire, contexts of domination. So the contexts, I think, in which these texts are coming out of are themselves violent contexts, and their responses to various kind of imperial control, and the violence related to that control. So I just kind of want to emphasize, I think, a little bit the response and the making sense of what are also kind of trauma events. And so how do we make sense of, how do we process these traumatic events like the exile, for example, and how do we make sense of God in that space? And and do we present God as kind of weak and powerless in the context of defeat and domination, or do we make sense of God as the one, or as part of inflicting that kind of violence and domination? And so I think we can also think about the broader context of empire and trauma as part of our thinking about divine violence as well.
Right.
And that comes out very clearly just in Revelation, the book of Revelation, which is one of the most violent books in the entire Christian Bible. And yeah, it's a beleaguered community of sort of early Jesus followers are trying to make sense of the fact that they're being persecuted and subjugated by the Roman Empire, and how can they have hope in their God? How can they envision God rescuing them and saving them? And so the way they do that is to present God as this really fierce warrior who, like, no holds barred, will use enormous amounts of violence to protect that community.
Right. How do you, to dive into probably the average person who's not a biblical scholar, how do you help them bridge that gap? Because you talked about kind of the historical, critical, and if you don't see the Bible as sort of, I mean, I think even people who do see it as inspired in some way, but are willing to create some distance, how do we go from this is what you described, Caroline, as a description of what's going on in the text. How does that get reconciled with people who still want to read the Bible as a part of their faith expression, as a part of kind of the means of grace? So this is a part of my Christian tradition. How now can I engage with these texts? Is it just a matter of, again, I come back to what you kind of said, is there's maybe a binary of, well, we just have to accept it because this is true and that's how it works. And then we have this complicated relationship with a violent God because it has to be true. Or this is contextual, Iron Age, tribalism and violence, and we can just disregard that, which would lead to people to, I think, just kind of skip those parts. So how do we engage with it from a faith perspective?
For me, one of the things that I'm interested in is, well, firstly, to not skip over the violence, to recognize it and to name it. But we don't have to always think positively about God's character in the Bible, although we might feel that, well, often as people of faith reading the Bible, we might feel like we need to defend God in that situation. And so the first thing I say is, actually, I don't think we need to defend God in this text. I think God is big enough for us to ask questions and to be critical. So the first thing for me is about asking us to think critically and to ask hard questions of the text. But I think for me, the fact that these stories are in the Bible, that they are in our sacred scriptures, they allow us to have hard conversations about hard things in our community. So the fact that these stories are there means that we can read about the violence in the text and we can ask questions about that. But then we can also talk about those issues in terms of how they relate to our contemporary communities. And so for me, I do think that there's, it's hard having these difficult texts in the Bible, but also I think they provide a really kind of sacred opportunity to have conversations about hard things, and about how we think about God and how we think of, and how we navigate that relationship between God and humanity and all of creation. They're difficult texts, but I think, and I don't want to take them at face value and just kind of say, well, they're there, and we have to make sense of them in a positive light. They're there, we have to wrestle with them, and then what does that mean for us on the ground?
And maybe what I'm hearing too is not necessarily even that we have to wrestle with them, but depending on your view of the Bible, like if you're going to the Bible to be a source of all the answers, I would think that would lead you to one of these binaries. Like it is either giving us the answer or we need to skip it because it's not going to give us a good answer. But what I'm hearing you say is if you engage the text in a different way altogether, that it is there to invite the conversation and it is there to provide sort of it's there to provide the fuel for conversation and discussion and disagreement and having the hard conversations and tying it into contemporary issues of faith and ethics and morality. Then it's not like we have to, it becomes a helpful tool, those passages to have those conversations. So it may depend on, what role do we feel like the Bible should play in our life of faith?
Yeah, it becomes a conversation partner with us, journeying with us. I think one of the things, so I work with communities where the Bible is taken very seriously, often quite literally. And one of my areas of interest, I think, is in gender-based violence in our communities. I mean, throughout, I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, so our communities have quite very high levels of sexual violence and gender-based violence. One of the things in these communities is that we don't talk about sexual violence. It's off limits. It's taboo. But the Bible becomes our common ground in those contexts because it's taken seriously. But also the Bible talks about sexual violence. And so in that way, the Bible becomes a springboard or an invitation to have conversations about things in our communities like sexual violence that are really hard to talk about or that are off limits. Because if the Bible talks about it, then maybe we can talk about it too. And so in that way, the Bible becomes an opening to conversations around violence, which we wouldn't otherwise be able to have.
Right. Caroline, to get you into this, do you use the language of, supporting, I think, what I'm hearing Emily say is, I think what you say when you, what you mean when you say violent texts allow us to really look at violence from a safe distance. Could you just expand on that? I think that's a great phrase.
Yeah. It's it's something that I've heard before because I'm a huge. Emily and I are both huge and unashamed fans of all things crime related, so crime fiction, crime drama, true crime, and it's something I've often heard. The term is used to try and explain why do we have this fascination with violent stories, not just biblical stories, but violent stories in general. And one of the theories, which I really like, is that, as human beings, we fear violence, but we're also part fascinated by it and part anxious about it. Whether or not we've experienced it ourselves, violent stories raise questions about, or they bring up themes about loss and injury and pain and grief and trauma. And we might be curious to learn more about these, but we don't want to experience them ourselves. Stories about violence give us a way to think about these themes and to ask questions about, what would make a fellow human being, just like me, behave in such a heinous way to someone else? What emotions drive that? What motivates them? How can I keep myself safe from violence? And these stories help us to think through that at a distance, because we're not having to experience the violence ourselves. We're standing back and sort of looking on as a spectator. But it does give us that chance to sort of mull over questions that we have about violence. Why do people perpetrate violence? What is it about our world that keeps violence flourishing? What can I do to maybe help stop violence? And so these stories give us an outlet for asking questions like that.
Yeah. So neither of the binaries, as Jared said, neither one or the other, but a third way of trying to process this. And again, this fascinates me because I like most people, I do struggle with these violent texts to know what to do with them. And if I'm frank, I'll say I'm not pleased with this, but I would say I just want to sort of write this off as Iron Age mentalities and say, well, you sort of said that before, but you're saying much more than that. That the God is portrayed in ways that make sense culturally for people, and all these ancient peoples had deities that had violent streaks in them, and they win wars for you, and they gain our territories. So they're sort of projections of what you have with monarchies and things like that. So I think on the one hand, I appreciate what you're saying about the presence of violence, of like human on human violence, and how that might go with, crime shows and things like that as an analogy. But I'm still stuck on divine violence. Solve that for us, please. You have a few minutes left, and what do we do with the texts? That's what I'm saying. What do we do with those stories, like the flood?
This might not answer the question for everyone, but a helpful way, I think, of thinking about these violent texts, particularly divine violence, is that if we look at biblical texts more widely, there are a lot of texts where we see protest against divine violence. We see it in the Psalms of Lament. We see it in the book of Job, particularly strongly. We see it in Genesis 18, where Abraham is arguing with God because of God's plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham is saying, you can't do that because there might be righteous people living in Sodom and Gomorrah. How on earth are you planning to destroy everyone? We see it in the book of Lamentations. And we also see God protesting violence generally in the prophets as well. God threatens a lot of violence in the prophets, but God also protests against the violence of others, particularly those that subjugate the most vulnerable members of the community, the poor and the oppressed. And so there's a tradition, and Walter Brueggemann, the theologian and biblical scholar, has spoken about this before. There's a long tradition in biblical texts of protesting violence, including divine violence. And I think we could say to people that are maybe uncomfortable about challenging or criticizing divine violence in the Bible, say, look, it's okay to be appalled by that violence. It's okay to say that it's not okay, because there's a long biblical tradition of saying that's not okay. Protesting divine violence is as biblical as the divine violence itself. And so you have permission to say, hang on a minute, that's not okay. That doesn't sound right to me.
And I appreciate you bringing that out. I've never maybe thought about it so starkly that within the prophets, it shows some consciousness being developed, maybe in that time period where there's an irony of, I'm going to violently punish you for your violence. And there's an interesting irony there that maybe shows the questions are being raised, but we maybe haven't gotten quite to the point of, wait, maybe God's not actually violent, and maybe that's why there's a call to nonviolence. And there's a bit of a time period of maybe an ironic time period there during that time. Can we maybe take a turn because, well, I want to make sure, did you get your questions answered about divine violence?
No.
Oh, okay, great. So that's perfect.
Can I add one more thing to that?
Yes.
Okay, this will do it.
This is it.
Go
okay,
on,
come
this
on.
will do it.
Here we go.
You're
Emily.
on. Go.
Let's do it.
Heads up. I won't answer your question, but I just want to add another thought. Because I think this comes back to what Kaz was saying earlier about our positioning in terms of how we understand the biblical text and where its authority comes from. And is this a text written by God or inspired by God, or is this a text that's written by human beings? And if the divine violence described in the text is God describing God's violence, then that's wild, that's problematic. And you're going to have to think critically around that. If this is a text that is written by human beings and their understanding and processing of their relationship with God, then you're asking a whole bunch of different questions. And this, I think, relates back to Kaz's point of the multiple voices in the text offering different positions on violence.
Right.
And so we have these voices that talk about the divine violence. We also have voices of protest. And for me, that's one of the most exciting things I love about the Bible, is that multiplicity of voices who are kind of all clamoring for attention in there.
Right.
And we get to engage with that multiplicity. And there's something, I think, rich and beautiful and life-giving about that.
Mm-hmm.
And that we just have to we've been given this tradition of holding in tension the manyness of the voices there.
Right.
And for me, that's a real gift.
Yeah. Well, I was kidding before when I said, no, you haven't. But both of you are saying things that I think are very important for people to hear. And I would make it two things you're saying. One is remember ancient context and people, if we think of the Bible as people reflecting on that which cannot be put into words, and we only have our language to do that, it's going to look a certain way. What are we doing? That's the same. We don't have some objective hold on the creator, right? So it is context, but it's also, especially what you were saying before, Caroline, the buzzword now is multivocality. There's dialogue within the Bible. There's debate. There's disagreement within the Bible. And that's the gift, right? That's the gift. That's like, okay, you have to work this out too, somehow. And good luck with that. But you have to try to figure out what to do about this. And I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. So thank you.
Yeah, and nothing says like you're in a group full of nerds when multivocality is a buzzword.
Yeah, I know.
It's like it's everywhere. Everyone's talking multivocality, aren't they?
At home in podcast land.
Well, maybe I want to, before we run out of time, I want to maybe jump to the New Testament a little bit. And I what I'm thinking of, not necessarily do we find violence in the New Testament, because you already mentioned Revelation, and I think it's there. But I do think it often, the idea of Christ, the life and the work of Jesus somehow affects how we approach that. And in some ways, it's trying to put a square peg into a round hole by trying to put these together. But I do hear that quite a bit in terms of, well, that was, it's that kind of classic, that was in the Hebrew Bible, but now Jesus has come. And so he's shown us a new way. But how do you sort of think about the life and work of Jesus as we find it in the New Testament? How does it intersect this idea of biblical violence?
I think in some way, in some ways, Jesus, as we, the Jesus that we read of in the Gospels, I can't speak of the historical figure, but the Jesus of the Gospels is in some ways a product of his time, in that he uses, as I said before, he uses violent language. He's not averse to that. He also seems fairly comfortable with the institution of enslavement, as was probably everyone or a lot of people back at that time. So I don't think, I think when we look at Jesus' life and ministry, he does focus on drawing in the marginalized and the oppressed, and he has a very prophetic voice in that sense. But there are other times when that, or there's perhaps limits to who he's drawing in, or there's limits to the liberation that he's offering in terms of, who will be really sort of liberated in the kingdom of God. So I'm always a little bit, I don't know, skeptical about claims that Jesus changes everything. That the violence still exists, right. But I think what Jesus does is, as I say, continues that prophetic tradition of questioning power. Because I think one thing we can maybe say about the majority of biblical violence is that it happens, and it's allowed to happen because of power differentials, because some people are more powerful than others, and those with power use violence and oppression to keep hold of their power and to subjugate those who have less power than them. And I think the one thing that Jesus does is that I admire the most, I think, is that he shines a light on that very much, and the Gospels as a whole remind us that the power of empire, the power of oppression, is incredibly violent and life diminishing. And right. What Jesus is doing through his ministry and his healings and his teachings is to talk about what happens when we remove that power, the power of empire, and can we imagine another way of living where people aren't subjugated? As I said, it's imperfect because, he talks about enslavement. He doesn't really talk to patriarchy, for example, but it's a text that was written in the first century. So maybe I'm just being maybe I'm being too critical or too judgmental about it. But it's, I think as contemporary readers, as 21st century readers, we have to acknowledge that at the same time.
Well, I know I've heard others say, and it helped me to work through this as well, that it's hard to understand really the rhetoric of violence if you're yourself in a privileged position.
Yes.
And I found that that's actually true, because it's easy for me to say, violence is wrong, but I don't know what I would do if ISIS were coming into my backyard. What would I be praying for God to do? I might sound like the book of Revelation pretty quickly, right? So but again, this is, if we read that as human expressions of save us, and this is the way it has to happen. We have to be safe from our oppressors, and that usually means killing them. Maybe that's what you pray for, right? But maybe that's imperfect, right? I know it's in the Bible, but maybe it's not the final story.
Yeah.
Can we, I hope we have a minute here, a couple minutes. I would love to hear your thoughts on crucifixion.
2 minutes.
No, not 2.5 minutes. 2.5 minutes.
Okay, I'll give you 2.5.
Explain crucifixion. Yeah. And as some have said, as an act of divine violence, even some have said divine child abuse. I'm not sure where I am with that. That doesn't sound terribly convincing to me, but I might be wrong. So just how do you process crucifixion, which is like the core of the Christian faith? There is a violent act going on there.
For me personally, I think the crucifixion is a form of state violence. It's structural violence. It's the violence of empire. Jesus was a political victim of violence at the hands of the Roman Empire, and I think that for me is how I perceive it. And I also think it's important to remember that during Jesus' passion and his crucifixion, he was utterly humiliated and shamed and stripped of all his power, his social power. He had no political power, and he stands as an example of the way that those in power can impact those with less power than them. And Jesus also stands as a reminder to contemporary readers, regardless of their faith, that imperial power, the power of the oppressors is never good. And it's, perhaps all of us can read the crucifixion story as a way, as Emily said earlier, as a sort of springboard to think about the way that same sort of structural and political violence continues today. And what can we do in our own contexts and communities to speak out against it, and to see Jesus not merely as a sort of divine or sort of religious or spiritual act, but a reminder to all of us that the crucifixion, the violence Jesus went through was not okay, and that we need to speak out against it.
And I'd maybe follow that up with, obviously people have, or Christians have read into that physical act of imperial violence, have read into that act a number of different kind of theologies and in order to make sense of that. And so we have within our tradition a number of different rationales or theologizings about that event. I think for me, and this is more of a faith statement than my own kind of academic scholarly work, I would want to say that the Easter event and the resurrection is a claim, I think, is a theological claim that violence isn't the end, that the violence of the cross is the violence of empire and domination, and that ultimately that's not the will of God, the systems of God and not the systems of domination. And for me, that's where I find meaning in that event.
That's it. See
That
you
was
later.
a good answer.
Yeah,
That
thanks.
was helpful. Thank you.
Bye. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I think that's a great, I think that was a good place to end. I'm kind of thinking through the trajectory of where we go from kind of starting in the flood in Genesis 18 and trying to understand that the Hebrew Bible and then through to the crucifixion and, understanding the violence that we find there through that particular lens. So I appreciate in particular, Caroline, kind of that, can we see it through this context? And then also Emily, then through the lens of theology or from a faith perspective. I think those are both helpful ways. And what it does is kind of remind me what we started with as we think about these texts, that there is an understanding of context that can be helped by more academic or scholarly, historical critical. What is the context? But then there's this faith and theological element that we inevitably have to engage in if we're going to be people of faith in the 21st century.
And that conversation doesn't end quickly.
Right.
It keeps going.
What I love is that they can be in conversation with each other. They're not mutually exclusive. And
kill you if I disagree with you.
Right.
So have we learned nothing here today?
Good. So thank you so much for coming in and sharing that perspective on this. Again, this is a perennial question that we get over and over again. So thank you for your perspective on it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone who supports the show. If you want to support what we do, there are 3 ways you can do it. 1, if you just want to give a little money, go to thebiblefornormalpeople.com/give.
And if you want to support us and want an all-access pass to our classes, ad-free live stream of the podcast, and a thoughtful community of people asking tough questions about the Bible and faith, you can become a member of our online community, the Society of Normal People, at thebiblefornormalpeople.com/join.
And lastly, it goes a long way if you just wanted to rate the podcast, leave a review, and tell others about our show. In addition, you can let us know what you thought about the episode by emailing us at info@thebiblefornormalpeople.com.
You've just made it through another episode of The Bible for Normal People. Don't forget you can catch our other show, Faith for Normal People, in the same feed wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was brought to you by the Bible for Normal People team. Brittany Hodge, Joel Limbowen, Melissa Yando, Tessa Stoltz, Danny Wong, Lauren O'Connell, and Naomi Gonzalez.
All right, everybody, it's that time of year again.
Sorry, I was thinking about the bleep. Do it again. I'm sorry. My ADHD mind was in another tab at that for the moment there. Good.
All right, we good?
Yeah. The live class and Q&A are happening on Thursday, June 26th from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time.
Nope. It is 8 to 9:30 p.m.
I was going to say that. I'm testing you.
8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 30. Is that what you were going to do?
It's the pressure of getting through all these in the time we have. I'm just,
we got
it's
plenty
too
of
much
time.
for me. Okay.